My name is Jack Thornton, and I'm 54 years old. For 23 years, I worked as head mechanic and equipment manager at Riverside Ranch, a 3,000-acre wheat and cattle operation in eastern Montana. This is the story of how I was replaced by the owner's nephew who couldn't tell a wrench from a ratchet, and how that decision nearly destroyed the ranch I'd helped build. I started at Riverside when I was 31, fresh from a divorce and looking for steady work that didn't involve too many people. The owner, Tom Gallagher, hired me to maintain the farm equipment: tractors, combines, balers, irrigation systems. The machinery was old, poorly maintained, constantly breaking down. Tom was a good rancher, but knew nothing about mechanics. He needed someone who could keep everything running without spending a fortune on new equipment. That someone was me. I'd grown up on a farm in North Dakota, learned mechanics from my father who could fix anything with duct tape and determination. After high school, I worked in diesel repair shops for a decade before the divorce sent me looking for a fresh start somewhere quiet. Riverside gave me that. The ranch sat along the Yellowstone River, surrounded by rolling wheat fields that turned gold every summer. The main house was a 100-year-old farmhouse where Tom lived with his wife, Margaret. The equipment barn was my domain, a massive metal building filled with machinery in various states of disrepair when I arrived. I spent that first year basically rebuilding everything. The John Deere combine was held together with rust and prayer. The irrigation pumps seized up constantly. The tractors burned oil like it was going out of style. I worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week during that initial period, taking apart engines, replacing worn parts, fabricating solutions when we couldn't afford proper replacements. Tom appreciated the work. He gave me a small cottage on the property, decent pay, and most importantly, autonomy. He understood that I knew equipment better than he did, trusted my judgment on what needed fixing and what could wait. That trust was the foundation of our working relationship for over 2 decades. I transformed that equipment barn into something special. Every tool had its place. Every machine had a maintenance log I kept meticulously. I could tell you the service history of every piece of equipment on that ranch going back 20 years. The combine that had been barely functional became so reliable that neighboring ranches would ask to borrow it during harvest season. The work was physical, often frustrating, sometimes dangerous, but it was mine. I understood those machines like some people understand computers or music. Every engine had a personality. Every tractor had its quirks. The old International Harvester needed 5 minutes to warm up before you could put it under load. The Massey Ferguson pulled slightly left, something in the steering I'd never quite fixed. The combine I'd practically rebuilt from the ground up needed a specific sequence to start. Throttle at half, wait for the fuel pump prime, then ignition while pumping the accelerator twice. These weren't just machines to me. They were tools I'd resurrected, maintained, coaxed back to life, season after season. When harvest came and 20,000 acres of wheat needed cutting in a 3-week window before weather turned, those machines performed flawlessly because I'd spent the previous 11 months making sure they would. Tom never questioned my methods. When I said we needed a part, he ordered it. When I recommended retiring a piece of equipment, he listened. When I suggested modifications or improvements, he gave me budget and freedom to implement them. It was a good arrangement. The ranch prospered partly because equipment costs stayed low while reliability stayed high. I lived simply in my cottage, a 1-bedroom place with a porch overlooking the wheat fields. Never remarried, never wanted to. Had a dog named Rusty, a border collie mix who followed me everywhere. Spent evenings reading mechanical manuals or working on small engines people brought me from town. The other ranch hands respected me. I was the guy who could fix anything, who'd pull a tractor out of mud at midnight during planting season, who'd fabricate a replacement part on Sunday so harvest could resume Monday. They knew I was reliable, skilled, fair. I trained 3 younger mechanics over the years, teaching them everything I knew about keeping equipment running in harsh Montana conditions. Life was predictable, satisfying in its routine. Spring meant preparing equipment for planting season. Summer was irrigation maintenance and hay season. Fall was harvest, the most critical and intense period when every machine needed to perform perfectly. Winter was rebuilding, servicing, preparing for the next cycle. 23 times through that cycle, each year blending into the next. Then last spring, Tom's nephew showed up. His name was Brandon Gallagher, 26 years old, fresh out of agricultural business school in Colorado. Tom's brother had died 2 years earlier, and Brandon was the only son, apparently eager to get into ranching. Tom, who had no children of his own, saw an opportunity to keep the ranch in the family eventually. Brandon arrived in a new pickup truck that cost more than I made in 2 years, wearing boots that had never seen mud, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd read books about farming but never actually farmed. Tom introduced him as someone who'd be learning the operation, eventually taking on more management responsibilities. I had no problem with that initially. Ranches need succession planning. Tom was 68, Margaret 65. They deserved to start thinking about retirement. If Brandon was willing to learn, I'd teach him what I could about the mechanical side just like I'd taught others. But Brandon wasn't interested in learning from me. He'd studied modern agricultural management, precision farming techniques, GPS-guided equipment. He looked at our machinery, reliable but old, with barely concealed disdain. He'd glance at my maintenance logs filled with handwritten notes and suggest we needed computerized management systems. During his first week, Brandon toured the equipment barn with Tom while I was replacing hydraulic lines on the big tractor. I heard him tell Tom that the machinery was outdated, that a modern operation needed newer, GPS-enabled equipment, that my maintenance approach was old-fashioned and inefficient. Tom defended me, saying everything ran fine, that reliability mattered more than features. But I could hear uncertainty in Tom's voice. Brandon spent that summer observing operations while supposedly learning the business. Mostly he stayed in the air-conditioned office, working on spreadsheets and business plans. He rarely came to the equipment barn, never asked to learn maintenance procedures, never got his hands dirty. The other ranch hands took to calling him the college boy behind his back. I tried to be fair. Maybe modern agricultural management really had evolved beyond what an old mechanic understood. Maybe computerized systems really were better than my notebooks. But watching Brandon operate, I noticed he knew theory without understanding practical reality. He'd suggest planting schedules that didn't account for actual soil conditions. He'd propose equipment modifications that would void warranties or create maintenance nightmares. Tom seemed torn. He wanted to believe his nephew could eventually run the ranch, but he also trusted the people who'd made it successful for decades. That tension simmered through the summer as Brandon gradually inserted himself into more decisions. The breaking point came in August. Tom called me to his office, asked me to sit down. Brandon was there, looking satisfied. Margaret was there too, looking uncomfortable. Tom told me that they'd decided to restructure operations, bring in younger management, modernize equipment and procedures. Brandon would become operations manager effective immediately, with authority over all ranch activities including equipment maintenance, and they were letting me go. After 23 years, they were replacing me with Brandon, who couldn't even change oil without instructions. Tom offered me 3 months severance, thanked me for my years of service. I sat there processing this information. 23 years of loyalty, of 12-hour days, of making ancient equipment run like new, of building something I was proud of, ended because Tom wanted to give his nephew a management position. Brandon couldn't do my job. He had no mechanical skills, no understanding of the equipment, no relationship with the machines I'd maintained for 2 decades. I asked Tom if this was really what he wanted. He looked away, said it was time for changes, that Brandon had modern training and new ideas. I looked at Margaret, who'd brought me lemonade on hot summer days, who'd invited me to holiday dinners when she knew I had nowhere else to go. She looked like she might cry, but said nothing. I stood up, shook Tom's hand, and left without arguing. What was the point? He'd made his decision. Maybe he was right that the ranch needed younger leadership. Maybe I was just an old mechanic who couldn't adapt to modern agricultural management. But as I walked back to my cottage, I knew with absolute certainty that Brandon Gallagher couldn't maintain that equipment. He simply didn't have the knowledge or skill. The next 3 months were strained. I continued working, training Brandon on maintenance procedures he clearly didn't care about. He'd nod along while checking his phone. interrupt with questions that showed he hadn't understood anything, suggest that most of this maintenance was unnecessary with newer equipment. I documented everything anyway, wrote detailed procedures for every machine, organized maintenance schedules for the next year. The other ranch hands were angry on my behalf. Several told Tom privately that this was a mistake, that Brandon didn't know what he was doing. Tom insisted everything would be fine, that Brandon would learn, that it was time for new generation leadership. The younger mechanic I'd been training, Miguel, told me he was planning to quit too. He wasn't staying to watch Brandon destroy everything we'd built. My last day was November 1st, just after harvest ended. I'd spent October preparing every machine for winter storage, documenting every quirk and requirement, organizing parts inventory, leaving everything in perfect condition. I wrote a 50-page maintenance manual covering every piece of equipment on the ranch, every common issue, every solution I'd developed over 2 decades. I presented it to Brandon in the equipment barn. He glanced through it, set it aside, told me he appreciated the effort, but modern equipment management relied on manufacturer specifications and computerized tracking systems, not handwritten notes from old mechanics who were stuck in the past. I didn't argue. I simply handed him the keys to the barn, the security codes, the supplier contacts I'd cultivated over 20 years. Tom gave me my severance check, shook my hand, thanked me for my years of service with the same speech he'd probably give to any employee. No acknowledgement that I'd been more than an employee. I'd been the person who kept his ranch running through droughts, floods, equipment failures, and economic downturns. Margaret hugged me, crying openly now. The ranch hands lined up to shake my hand, several emotional. Miguel told me he'd given notice. I loaded my tools into my pickup, the personal tools I'd accumulated over 2 decades, the specialty equipment I'd fabricated myself. I called Rusty, and we drove away from Riverside Ranch for what I thought was the last time. In the rearview mirror, I saw Brandon standing outside the equipment barn, already on his phone, probably calling equipment dealers about modernizing the fleet. I rented a small apartment in town, 30 miles from the ranch. Found work at a diesel repair shop. Boring, routine maintenance compared to what I'd been doing, but steady pay. Tried not to think about Riverside, about the equipment I'd built and maintained, about the life I'd lost to nepotism. Winter passed. I heard through the grapevine that Miguel had quit as promised. Brandon hired a maintenance company from Billings to handle equipment servicing, paying them what they probably paid me in a year for a fraction of the work. The other ranch hands reported that Brandon was rarely in the equipment barn, that machines were developing issues because preventative maintenance wasn't happening. Tom apparently defended his nephew, said growing pains were normal. Spring came. Planting season approached, the critical window when equipment absolutely must work perfectly. I was changing transmission fluid on a semi-truck at the repair shop when my phone rang. It was Tom Gallagher. His voice had a panic I'd never heard before. He asked if I could come to the ranch immediately. They had an emergency. The combine wouldn't start, and they needed to begin harvest in 48 hours. The maintenance company from Billings had spent 3 days trying to diagnose the problem without success. Brandon had tried everything he could think of. They were desperate. Tom would pay me whatever I asked. Just please come help. I almost said no. Almost told him that he'd made his choice, hired modern management, didn't need an old mechanic stuck in the past. But I thought about that combine, the machine I'd rebuilt from scrap, maintained for 20 years, knew better than I knew my own truck. I thought about 20,000 acres of wheat that would be lost if harvest didn't happen on schedule. I thought about the ranch hands who depended on successful harvest for their jobs. I told Tom I'd come look at it. No promises, no commitment to fix anything, just a look. He thanked me profusely, said he'd pay my shop rate plus travel, whatever I needed. I told him I'd be there in an hour, hung up, and informed my shop supervisor I was taking personal time. The drive to Riverside felt strange after 5 months away. The wheat fields were golden, ready for cutting, exactly like 23 previous seasons I'd seen. I turned into the ranch entrance, past the Gallagher family sign. The equipment barn looked different somehow, less organized, tools scattered rather than hung properly, maintenance schedules I'd posted now replaced with printed manufacturer guidelines that nobody seemed to be following. The combine sat outside, hood open, surrounded by parts and frustrated people. Tom rushed over as I parked, looking older than I remembered, stress evident in his face. He shook my hand with both of his, thanking me for coming, apologizing for how things ended. Brandon stood near the combine, defensive body language clear. The maintenance company technicians, two young guys with company uniforms and diagnostic computers, looked relieved to see someone else taking responsibility. I walked to the combine, my combine, the machine I'd spent hundreds of hours rebuilding. Just looking at it, I could see the problem. Someone had replaced the fuel pump incorrectly. The fuel lines were connected wrong, the primer bulb was missing, and they'd installed a pump meant for a different engine model. The diagnostic computers couldn't tell them this because it wasn't a computer problem. It was a mechanical understanding problem. I asked who'd replaced the fuel pump. Brandon said the maintenance company had done it last month during routine service. The technicians checked their records, confirmed they'd replaced the pump per manufacturer specifications for that model year. Except this combine wasn't standard. I'd modified it 15 years ago, installing a more reliable pump system that required specific components. I pointed out the errors: wrong pump model, incorrect line routing, missing primer. The technicians looked embarrassed, realizing they'd followed a manual without understanding the actual machine. Brandon looked defensive, saying the modifications weren't documented in any official records. I reminded him about the 50-page maintenance manual I'd written, which included detailed documentation of every modification I'd made to every machine. He admitted he didn't know where that manual was, probably thrown away when he'd cleaned out the equipment barn, replacing my system with his computerized tracking that didn't actually track anything useful. I told them I could fix it, but I'd need the correct parts, the specific fuel pump model I'd always used, available from a supplier in Billings I'd worked with for 20 years. Tom said get whatever I needed. Cost didn't matter. Brandon started to argue about using manufacturer-specified parts, but Tom cut him off sharply, telling him to be quiet and let me work. The parts store in Billings still had my account, still stocked the components I'd always ordered. They rushed the parts out, delivery by late afternoon. While waiting, I walked through the equipment barn, cataloging everything that had degraded in 5 months. Machines that should have been serviced weren't. Maintenance schedules ignored. Parts inventory chaotic. My organized system replaced by expensive disorder. When the parts arrived, I installed the correct fuel pump, routed the lines properly, primed the system. The combine started on the first try, engine running smooth and strong just like it had for 20 years. Tom looked relieved. Brandon looked angry. The maintenance technicians looked confused about how something so simple had stumped them. Tom asked if I'd stay through harvest, supervise equipment operations, make sure everything ran smoothly. The same work I'd done for 23 years, now being requested as emergency consulting. I could have said no, could have made him beg, could have demanded triple my old salary. Instead, I looked at that combine, at the equipment I'd built, and said yes, not for Tom, not for Brandon, but for the machines that deserved better than neglect. The next 3 weeks, I basically moved back into my old cottage, back into my old routine. I serviced every machine, fixed everything that had been neglected, ran the harvest operation exactly as I'd always done. The equipment performed flawlessly because I knew every machine's requirements, every quirk, every necessary adjustment. Brandon watched from a distance, no longer pretending to manage operations. Tom worked alongside me like the old days, acknowledging silently that his nephew experiment had failed. Margaret brought me meals, trying to make up for what they'd done. The ranch hands welcomed me back like I'd never left, working smoothly under my direction. Harvest finished successfully. 20,000 acres cut, processed, stored without significant equipment downtime. The ranch would make its numbers, survive another year, continue operating. When the last load was stored, Tom asked me to come to his office. He and Margaret sat me down, offered me my job back permanently. Same position, better pay, written guarantee of autonomy over equipment operations. Brandon would focus on business management, books, sales, administrative work, but equipment maintenance would be mine again, officially and permanently. Tom admitted he'd made a mistake, said he'd let family loyalty override good judgment, that the ranch needed me more than it needed modern management theories. I considered the offer. Part of me wanted to accept, return to work I loved, to machines I understood, to life that had been satisfying for over 2 decades. But another part of me remembered how easily I'd been discarded, how little my 23 years had mattered when nepotism came calling, how Tom had chosen family over loyalty. I told him I appreciated the offer, but no. I'd come back for harvest because the machines needed me, and the ranch hands deserved successful season. But I wasn't staying permanently. I'd learned that job security meant nothing when family politics entered the equation. I'd rather work at the repair shop in town doing routine maintenance on strangers' trucks than invest my heart in something that could be taken away on family whim. Tom looked devastated but accepted my decision. He asked if I'd at least consult part-time, help train a new head mechanic, provide guidance during critical seasons. I agreed to that. Reasonable consulting arrangement, proper pay, clear boundaries. That was 8 months ago. I still consult for Riverside Ranch periodically, training the new mechanic Tom hired, a solid guy in his 40s who respects the equipment and actually wants to learn. Brandon handles office work and stays away from the barn. Tom and I have professional relationship now, not the friendship we once had. Margaret still brings me pie occasionally, her way of apologizing. I kept my job at the repair shop, bought a small place on 5 acres outside town, got another dog to keep Rusty company. Life is different than it was, smaller in some ways, but also more secure. I'm not dependent on one employer's loyalty, not vulnerable to family politics, not building something that can be taken away arbitrarily. The experience taught me hard lessons about loyalty and value in agricultural work. Skills matter, but family matters more. Dedication means nothing against nepotism. And sometimes the machines you love aren't worth the heartbreak of losing them to people who don't understand their value. But I also learned that true expertise can't be replaced by degrees or modern management theories. Brandon's agricultural business education couldn't start that combine. The maintenance company's computers couldn't diagnose what I saw instantly. All the modernization in the world doesn't replace deep knowledge earned through decades of hands-on work. I miss that life sometimes. Miss the routine, miss the satisfaction of keeping complex machinery running, miss the pride of successful harvests. But I don't miss the vulnerability of depending on someone else's appreciation of my value. Now, when I work on equipment, it's on my terms, with clear boundaries, without emotional investment that can be weaponized against me. Tom calls sometimes, talks about the ranch, mentions that things aren't quite the same without me there full time. I listen politely. Give advice when asked. Maintain professional distance. The ranch will survive. The new mechanic is competent. The equipment is sound. The operation can function. It just won't be what it was, what we built together over 23 years. And maybe that's okay.